It was the kind of Thursday people don't remember until something goes wrong. Clear skies, 68 degrees, that lull in late spring when the cold's gone and summer hasn't yet arrived. Melissa Warner had left work early that day, just after 2:45 p.m., telling her boss she had errands to run and wanted to pick up Caleb before the after-school crowd hit traffic. She worked reception at a dental clinic in a nearby strip mall. Reliable, quiet. 30 minutes later, she pulled into the tiny parking lot of Little Steps Daycare, a 2-story converted house nestled between an insurance office and a church. The daycare worker on shift, a teenager named Felicia, remembered Melissa signing Caleb out at 3:32 p.m. Caleb was 3.5, happy, a little sleepy from playtime. He held her hand as they walked down the sidewalk. They turned the corner onto Tanglewood Drive. That was the last time anyone reported seeing them. Melissa lived at 419 Tanglewood, half of a beige duplex about 7 minutes' walk from the daycare. The neighborhood was suburban middle class, ranch homes, trimmed hedges, retired couples on porches. Nobody locked their gates. Kids rode bikes till dusk. Melissa's unit had white shutters and a garden of daffodils she'd planted with her sister the year before. Her car, a pale silver Toyota Camry, was already parked out front. She hadn't driven to the daycare. She preferred to walk when the weather was nice. By 6 p.m., Melissa's mother, Denise, started calling. At first, it wasn't unusual. Melissa sometimes let Caleb nap after daycare. Sometimes her phone died. But when no one picked up after 4 calls, Denise texted, "You okay?" No reply. Another hour passed, then another. By 8:30 p.m., Denise called Melissa's younger sister, Amanda, who lived about 15 minutes away. Amanda agreed to swing by and check. She arrived just after 9 p.m. The porch light was off, all the windows dark. The Camry still sat in the driveway, unmoved. Amanda knocked once, then again. No answer. She tried the doorknob, but it was locked. Melissa usually left it unlocked when expecting someone. Amanda called out. Nothing. She circled the house, checked the backyard. Caleb's tricycle leaned against the fence, the same place it had been 2 days ago. Lights off, curtains drawn. Amanda called 911. The first officer on scene didn't break the door. There was no sign of forced entry, no sign of a struggle from the outside, just a locked door and silence. Technically, it wasn't a crime, not yet. Adults were allowed to disappear. Mothers with young children less so, but the officer suggested waiting until morning. Maybe Melissa had taken Caleb to a friend's house. Maybe her phone had died and she'd fallen asleep early. Amanda didn't believe that. Denise didn't either. By morning, nothing had changed. Melissa's car was still there. No one had seen her. Her phone still rang and went to voicemail. At 8:15 a.m., after getting permission from the landlord, police entered the duplex. What they found was unsettling, not alarming at first glance, but wrong in a way that lingered. The living room was tidy, mail stacked by the door, a sippy cup on the coffee table. Caleb's shoes were by the front mat. His backpack hung neatly on a hook near the door. In the kitchen, dishes were washed and drying on a rack. Milk and sandwich meat were in the fridge, still cold. On the stove was a saucepan with 2 hot dogs floating in cloudy water, cold now. A receipt from the market down the block sat on the counter, time-stamped 3:10 p.m., the last confirmed moment of routine. In Caleb's room, his blanket was folded, his nightlight unplugged. Melissa's bedroom had laundry sorted on the bed, some already folded. Her phone charger was plugged in by the nightstand, but the phone wasn't there. Her purse wasn't either. But her keys, her house keys, sat in the bowl by the door. That was the part Amanda couldn't make sense of. Melissa never left without her keys. By noon, missing persons reports were filed. Flyers were printed by 3 p.m. Police spoke with the daycare again, then canvassed the neighborhood. No signs of struggle, no broken windows, no sign of a break-in. But something wasn't right. Caleb would have needed snacks, diapers, toys. None were missing. His favorite stuffed dog was still in his bed. Melissa never left without it. That toy had gotten her through nights when Caleb had the flu, through doctor visits, through tears. She wouldn't have forgotten it, not if she planned on being gone long. Neighbors were interviewed. Most hadn't seen anything. A couple recalled seeing her earlier that day walking with Caleb. One remembered a woman who looked like Melissa passing by with a bag from the market. No one remembered hearing anything strange. No screams, no fights, just the soft rhythm of a day like any other. And yet, Melissa and Caleb were gone. Not runaways, not travelers, just gone. Amanda stayed that night in Melissa's house. She couldn't sleep. The air felt wrong, too still. She walked the halls, checked Caleb's room 3 times. At 3 a.m., she thought she heard something through the vent, a soft sound, like a breath maybe, but it was probably the heater, or maybe grief making noise out of silence. That weekend, search dogs were brought in. They picked up a scent from the sidewalk, Melissa's route home, but it stopped at her front gate. Not the porch, not the door, just gone. The first week became the first month. The duplex sat quiet. Police kept digging, but no new evidence came. The official report listed the time of disappearance as between 3:40 and 6:00 p.m., April 16, 2009. A 1-hour walk, a routine day. A mother and child lost in the narrow space between sunlight and supper. And then, in a town where nothing ever happened, people began to lock their doors. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. A small beige duplex with white trim and a chain-link fence, Melissa Warner's home stood like every other house on Tanglewood Drive. The porch light was still off, the car still in the driveway, the front door locked. When police entered that Friday morning, they expected disorder, signs of panic, maybe violence. What they found instead was a quiet house holding its breath. The living room was untouched, throw pillows fluffed. A photo of Melissa and Caleb at a pumpkin patch leaned on the windowsill. In the kitchen, dishes were clean and stacked. The fridge had fresh milk. A banana had begun to brown on the counter. Beside it, a folded receipt from Tanglewood Market, $13.72 for hot dogs, apple juice, and a bag of pretzels. Timestamp 3:10 p.m. She'd walked back, unloaded groceries, maybe started dinner. Then, nothing. Her phone charger was plugged in. But the phone itself wasn't there. The police found it in the couch cushions, battery dead. Her keys, used to lock the door from the outside, were in the ceramic dish by the entry. Her purse, however, was gone. Caleb's favorite toy, a stuffed gray dog with a fraying ear, lay in his bed. His sneakers were under the coffee table. Nothing in the home showed signs of struggle. But the more time investigators spent inside, the more the stillness felt off. The bathroom was clean, too clean. Towels were slightly damp. A faint scent of shampoo lingered in the air. The tub had droplets drying along the edge, like it had been drained not long before the door was opened. A folded stack of freshly laundered clothes sat in a plastic basket just inside the bedroom. Caleb's pajama pants, a t-shirt, and a woman's blouse. Still warm when Amanda had checked the night before. Police couldn't tell if Melissa had been preparing for the night ahead or something else. They documented the scene carefully, took photographs, bagged the hot dog saucepan, checked closets and crawl spaces. In the backyard, nothing unusual. No signs of someone coming over the fence, no footprints in the flower beds. The front door had been locked, the windows all closed, no damage, no entry, no exit. Just a sealed house holding 1,000 silent questions. When police canvassed the neighborhood again, they found little more. Most residents hadn't noticed anything out of place. One neighbor, a retired teacher named Janet Howell, who lived 2 doors down, mentioned hearing a strange, muffled sound the day before, around 4 p.m. She said it could have been the TV or someone moving furniture. She hadn't thought much of it, but she remembered pausing her audiobook and tilting her head, just long enough to notice the house across the fence was oddly quiet. No toddler laughter, no voices. Then it stopped. Silence again. The detective noted that Melissa had likely returned home around 3:40 p.m. Her walk from daycare took about 8 minutes. That left a very narrow window between the time she walked inside and the time her mother began calling to explain how 2 people could vanish without any signs of violence, escape, or a trace. In Melissa's bedroom, a canvas grocery bag was missing, one she used often. The matching one still hung on a hook in the kitchen. It wasn't enough to suggest she left voluntarily, but it was noted. The purse was gone, but there were no bank withdrawals, no travel searches on her work computer, no packed bags. Her makeup sat untouched on the bathroom shelf. Her laptop was on the dining table, still open to a half-written email draft. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a few lines that trailed off mid-sentence. The detective sergeant, a veteran with 2 decades of missing persons work behind him, admitted privately that he couldn't get the layout of the house out of his head. Everything was too neat, as if someone had taken great care not to disturb anything. It didn't feel like a panic. It felt planned. Still, they couldn't say for certain that Melissa had been taken. Some argued she might have left on her own. The daycare receipt showed she had no intention of staying out long. She bought hot dogs and juice, comfort food, simple, ordinary things. The folded laundry suggested preparation or distraction. Maybe she planned to bathe Caleb and relax after a long week, or maybe she was packing to leave. But there were holes in every theory. If she'd run away, why leave behind her phone and keys? Why abandon her car, the one she used daily? If she'd been abducted, why was there no sign of forced entry? No neighbors saw anyone enter or leave the home. There were no loud noises, no screams, no struggle, just a locked door and still air. The theory of a voluntary disappearance faded quickly under scrutiny. Friends and family insisted Melissa wasn't running from anything. She loved her son. She had no financial troubles, no known enemies. Her ex, Caleb's father, hadn't seen her in over a year and was cleared quickly. He had an alibi. No other names surfaced, no stalkers, no suspicious co-workers, just an ordinary woman in an ordinary house on an ordinary day. And yet, 2 lives had been swallowed in less than an hour. That weekend, flyers were taped to street lamps and pinned to bulletin boards. Missing: Melissa Warner and son, Caleb. Her photo, a warm smile, shoulder-length hair, was printed beside Caleb's round face, cheeks dimpled in mid-laugh. Local news ran the story. Police set up a tip line. Volunteers gathered at the community center, but every search turned up empty. As the days wore on, the house remained undisturbed. The daffodils outside began to wilt. Amanda watered them, unwilling to let anything else die. Inside, the photo on the windowsill stayed exactly where Melissa had left it, smiling, still, waiting. The break in the case didn't come from a detective or forensic team. It came from a neighbor. 8 days after Melissa and Caleb vanished, a woman named Eleanor Bridges walked into the precinct on her own. 62 years old, retired librarian, lived 6 houses down. She'd seen the missing posters, of course. She recognized Melissa. She remembered the little boy. But what had caught her attention wasn't a face, it was a vehicle. She said she hadn't come forward earlier because she hadn't been sure it mattered, but the image had stayed with her all week. A dark green van parked just outside Melissa's duplex on the day they disappeared. She'd seen it while watering her plants, said it was idling for a long time, engine running, but no one getting in or out. "Not the kind of thing you forget in a neighborhood like this," she said. "Nobody drives vans anymore. And this one didn't look like it belonged." The van had no visible plates. It sat there, motionless for at least 20 minutes. She couldn't recall the make or model, just that it was boxy, maybe early 2000s, with a wide rear window and dark paint dulled by time. No logos, no decals, just parked. She remembered it because she thought it looked out of place and too old to be anyone's work van. She didn't see who got in or out, didn't hear doors open. She assumed it was a contractor visiting someone, maybe a delivery driver. But there were no packages, no movement, just the hum of an engine she could hear from her porch. She believed she saw it sometime between 4:10 and 4:30 p.m. She didn't check the time, but remembered a gardening show had just ended on the radio. Detectives took her account seriously. It was the first independent sighting of anything unusual on the street that day. They canvassed the area again, asking anyone else if they'd seen a green van. A teenager across the street recalled seeing a big green car parked along the sidewalk, but hadn't paid much attention. Another neighbor said she'd heard a vehicle idling around that time, but hadn't looked outside. No one saw it leave. No one saw who drove it. Investigators turned to traffic cameras at both ends of Tanglewood Drive, low-resolution city-owned units mounted near intersections. There was one facing the north exit, another on a stoplight a block south. They pulled the footage from April 16th and reviewed it frame by frame. Nothing. No green van entering or exiting. No license plates matched descriptions given. No known work vans in the area that day were unaccounted for. It was as if the vehicle had appeared and disappeared without ever traveling on a main road. They checked deliveries. No service vehicles had appointments on Tanglewood that afternoon. Garbage pickup had been the day before. No city maintenance logged, no plumbing, electrical, or HVAC calls reported. Nothing tied to the address. And yet, a dark green van had sat outside Melissa Warner's home at the precise time she and her son went missing. They began pulling vehicle records for green vans registered in the county. Hundreds. They filtered for older models, unregistered vehicles, even stolen ones. It took weeks. No matches. Police considered the possibility the plates had been removed or concealed intentionally. If so, it wasn't random. Someone had parked that van there, idling, for a reason. The location of the van mattered. It wasn't parked across the street or casually nearby. It was close, right outside Melissa's gate, a few feet from her front steps. That timing, shortly after 4 p.m., was narrow, right after she would have returned from daycare. The theory began to form quietly, behind closed doors, that someone had been waiting. But if it was an abduction, it had been executed flawlessly. There was no surveillance footage, no fingerprints, no signs of a forced grab, no dragging, no witnesses to a confrontation, no tire marks, nothing. As the weeks passed, the green van became a ghost, mentioned in news articles, whispered about in online forums, brought up during community meetings. Some speculated it belonged to someone Melissa knew. Others believed it was someone who had watched her routine long enough to strike. Either way, the van became the one tangible detail in a case defined by its absences. The problem was, it led nowhere. Without license plates, without confirmation of make or model, without surveillance, there was nothing to trace. Police even consulted retired detectives from similar cases. Nothing comparable. No clear patterns, no known offenders in the area matching that M.O. Melissa's family clung to the sighting as proof she hadn't just walked away. To them, the van was validation. Something had happened. Someone had taken her. But without a face, without a direction, the lead faded. And as quickly as it had surfaced, the van vanished, folding into the silence that had settled over Tanglewood Drive. A vehicle no one owned. A sound few heard. A neighborhood where nothing ever happened, until something did. In those first weeks, when Melissa Warner's name still ran across the evening news and missing flyers were posted on gas pumps and grocery doors, most attention stayed focused on the obvious, the van, the front door, the narrow window of time. But quietly, in the background of every conversation, there was always one detail people danced around. A man whose name surfaced again and again, never as a suspect, but as a curiosity. Gregory Neal, 73, lived in the other half of the duplex. He had moved into 421 Tanglewood nearly 2 decades earlier after retiring from the post office. He was known to be solitary, kept to himself, didn't attend block parties, rarely spoke to neighbors unless necessary. Not rude, not friendly, just there. Some described him as quiet, others called him odd. He trimmed his hedges precisely every Sunday morning and retrieved his mail the moment the truck pulled up. He didn't have a visible car. When police canvassed the duplex during the initial investigation, they knocked on Mr. Neal's door. He answered promptly, said he'd been out of town that week, visiting his sister in Kentucky, gave the name, gave the city, said he'd returned just that morning and had heard the news from a neighbor. The officers didn't press. They noted the details, took his contact information, moved on. He wasn't on any registry, had no prior criminal record, no complaints, no visible connection to Melissa, and there were no signs linking his side of the property to the disappearance. But there was one architectural feature that went unexamined: the shared basement. Like many older duplexes in the area, the foundation included a joint access cellar, a space originally designed for laundry and utilities. Over time, as the tenants grew more private, the shared door that once connected both sides had been sealed off, padlocked, boarded, walled, depending on which tenant you asked. By 2009, no one used the basement for anything more than storage. Each unit had its own access door from the backyard, but the passage between them remained sealed. Amanda had asked about it once. She remembered Melissa mentioning the basement felt creepy, especially at night. The shared wall had an old air vent that rattled during storms. At times, Melissa said she could hear noises, shifting, soft metallic thuds, though she chalked it up to the boiler system. Police never searched Neal's side. Without probable cause, without suspicion, there was no legal reason to. He was cooperative, pleasant even. He showed them his kitchen, his hallway, his garden. A bit dusty, but nothing out of place. No odd smells, no strange noises. He'd been out of town, he said, and there was no proof otherwise. But in the months that followed, neighbors began to whisper. It started subtly, just comments about how something didn't feel right. A faint smell that lingered near the backyard walkway. Something sour. Some said it reminded them of spoiled meat. Others blamed old plumbing. No one reported it. No one wanted to point fingers without reason. Still, some avoided walking too close to that side of the duplex. They couldn't explain it. They just did. The smell faded by midsummer. Mr. Neal remained quiet. He continued his routines, sat on his porch some evenings, nodding at passers-by, never brought up the case again. Eventually, the story died down. The flyers came down. The neighborhood adjusted. Melissa's duplex was vacated and eventually sold. A young couple moved in for a time, then renters. Then it sat empty for a few years. Mr. Neal never moved, and the basement was forgotten again. But when the case resurfaced years later, when details began to return to the surface, so did that name. Gregory Neal, still alive until 2018, died quietly of heart failure in his sleep. No known relatives besides the sister he'd once visited, who had since passed away. No will, no burial. Just a death notice and a locked-up duplex eventually handed over to a distant nephew who never came to claim it. What's strange is what neighbors remembered after he died. A few recalled him walking outside at odd hours the week Melissa vanished. One remembered seeing him near the side gate late at night with a flashlight. Another swore she heard noises from the basement during a storm, metal scraping, a sharp knock against the wall, but had dismissed it at the time. None of them told police. Not then. It didn't feel right to accuse a quiet old man who'd lived there longer than most of them, but it was the smell that stayed with people. It hadn't been strong, just persistent. A musty chemical odor, faint enough to ignore, lingering enough to remember. Some thought it came from the soil, others from cleaning products, but no one looked into it. The shared basement was just a relic, locked, unused, out of sight. By the time anyone thought to examine it, years had passed. The memory of the disappearance had faded into silence, replaced by routine and forgetfulness. No one dared to suggest what might have happened behind that sealed wall, and no one wanted to be the one to pry it open. Until someone finally did. By the end of the first year, the phone had stopped ringing. The tip line, once buzzing with false leads and vague sightings, went quiet. The flyers, faded, sun-bleached, torn at the corners, still clung to the corkboard at Tanglewood Market, but fewer people stopped to read them. The case of Melissa Warner and her son Caleb had slipped into that gray space between mystery and memory, where urgency gave way to quiet resignation. There had been no activity on her bank accounts, no credit card usage. Her cell phone had never been turned back on. Her social security number hadn't pinged once. There were no sightings, no evidence, no remains, just nothing. Detectives followed every angle they could. Caleb's father was questioned early. He and Melissa hadn't spoken in over a year. Their relationship had ended badly, but without violence or custody disputes. He had moved 2 towns over and was remarried. His alibi for the day Melissa disappeared checked out. Work records, video surveillance, statements. He was cleared, though some in the family remained suspicious, not out of evidence but out of desperation. They needed someone to blame. The green van became a ghost story. People still mentioned it, but like a shadow they couldn't trace. The police bulletin described it as an unidentified dark green full-size van, possibly early 2000s model, last seen idling near 419 Tanglewood Drive. But without plates or a clear make, it led nowhere. The longer it went unsolved, the more people began to doubt if it had ever been real at all. Melissa's family held on to hope longer than most. Denise, her mother, drove every back road for miles, eyes peeled for abandoned barns, dirt turnoffs, motel lots. Amanda, her sister, wrote letters to local news stations every few months, trying to keep the story alive. But the world moved on. Other cases took headlines. Other tragedies took the public's attention. The duplex changed hands in 2011. The landlord sold it to a property management company that specialized in low-cost rentals. Melissa's side of the unit stayed empty for a while. People felt strange about it. Some said they heard things at night, creaks, faint tapping, most likely the old plumbing or shifting walls, but still. Rent dropped, and eventually new tenants moved in. Families, young couples, people who'd never heard of Melissa Warner. Gregory Neal, meanwhile, stayed put. He remained a quiet fixture at the far end of the street, trimming hedges and sitting on his porch most evenings, eyes behind thick glasses, unmoved. He kept to himself even more as the years passed. No visitors, no noise. A few neighbors saw him walking his trash out late at night, always alone. He stopped speaking entirely to those who lived nearby. And then, in the fall of 2018, he died in his sleep. It was the mail carrier who noticed something was wrong. Letters piling up in the box, a newspaper left to yellow on the porch. The coroner's report listed natural causes, heart failure, no signs of distress, no will, no instructions. He had one next of kin, a nephew listed on a dusty contact card in a drawer. The nephew, a man named Ryan Neal, lived 2 states away. When reached, he declined to claim the property, citing no contact in over 20 years and personal disinterest. The management company secured the unit and locked it. Melissa's family never learned of Gregory Neal's death until later, when it was too late to matter. By 2020, the case was cold. The official status read, "Unresolved disappearance, open but inactive." Police records were boxed and stored. The detective originally assigned had retired. The new one, a junior officer with a heavy caseload, barely had time to review the file. No fresh leads, no evidence to re-examine. The investigation, once promising, now sat buried beneath dust and silence. Amanda moved out of state. She said it became too hard to walk past the place where her sister had last been seen. Denise, older now, still kept Melissa's room the same. Caleb's drawings were pinned to a bulletin board above the dresser. A sippy cup sat on the nightstand. Every year on April 16th, she lit a candle in the window and left the porch light on, just in case. There were moments when the case flickered back into conversation. A local podcast once covered it. A new detective briefly reopened the file during training, but each time, it led nowhere. No DNA, no bodies, no new witnesses. The house, the car, the neighborhood, all stood unchanged. Time passed, but the mystery didn't. What remained was a vacancy, the absence of 2 people whose names stopped echoing beyond their own street. A mother, a child, a walk home, a locked door, a mystery that didn't grow, it simply froze. And as years went by, the ache shifted from fear to something quieter. Flyers curled and fell. Google searches led to dead links. A page in a missing persons database remained live, visited occasionally, mostly by strangers. But no one expected anything to change, because some stories don't end with discovery. They simply stop being told. By the time Ariel Graham signed the lease in early spring of 2025, the left side of the duplex on Tanglewood Drive had sat unoccupied for nearly 2 years. The property management company offered it at a discount, listed as a quiet unit with long-term potential. Ariel was a single mother trying to start over. It was close to her daughter's preschool, close to work, and just barely within budget. She didn't ask too many questions. No one volunteered any answers. The day she moved in, the house felt still. Not empty, still. The kind of quiet that presses against your ears. The walls were freshly painted, the carpet was new. But the air carried a faint chill, even in late April. Ariel brushed it off. Old houses had quirks. She'd lived in worse. Her daughter Evie was 4, sharp-eyed, dreamy. She was small for her age, still dragged a blanket from room to room and asked too many questions. From the beginning, Evie didn't like her bedroom. She said the closet made noises and the floor breathed. Ariel assumed it was an overactive imagination adjusting to a new space. She moved a nightlight into the hallway and told Evie the pipes made sounds when the house got sleepy. That answer worked, for a while. A week later, Ariel noticed the water pressure in the shower dipped every few minutes. The lights flickered once during dinner. She found cold spots in the hallway that didn't line up with the vents. Minor annoyances, nothing urgent. But the house always felt just a few degrees off, like it hadn't been lived in for a very long time and hadn't quite forgiven that. Then Evie said something she couldn't explain. They were coloring in the living room one morning when Evie paused, tilted her head toward the floor vent, and said softly, "He's back." Ariel didn't understand. "Who?" "The boy in the vent," Evie replied, not looking up from her crayons. "He asked if it's still raining." Ariel froze. "What boy?" Evie shrugged. "He says it was raining when he left. He wants to know if it stopped." Ariel did what most parents would do. She smiled, nodded, and changed the subject. Kids make things up. They build entire worlds out of floorboards and ceiling fans. She chalked it up to a new house and unfamiliar sounds. But later that night, she checked the vent. Nothing inside, just dust and rust. Still, she moved Evie's bed closer to her own and slept with the hallway door cracked open. A few days later, while reorganizing the hall closet, Ariel noticed the panel. It was behind a low rack of coats, just slightly off-center, flush with the drywall but marked by paint that didn't quite match. About 2 feet wide, screwed shut along the corners. An old maintenance hatch, maybe. It hadn't been listed on the inspection notes. She hesitated. Something about the way it sat in the wall felt deliberate, like it wasn't meant to be seen. But curiosity got the better of her. She grabbed a screwdriver and pried one edge loose. The wood groaned slightly as it shifted. A gust of air pushed out, musty and cold. Inside was a shallow cavity, no more than a foot deep. Dust layered everything. Insulation clung to the interior, but wedged between 2 studs was a narrow, water-damaged object wrapped in plastic. She pulled it out. It was a drawing, done in crayon on a piece of faded printer paper. The lines were faint but still visible. A crude figure of a woman with long hair, holding hands with a small child. Next to them, looming larger, was a dark, boxy shape. A van, maybe, all green. The figures had round eyes and little mouths shaped like ovals. Above them, scribbled clouds and long lines falling like rain. A child's name was written in the corner, C.W. Ariel sat on the hallway floor for several minutes, the drawing in her lap. She didn't know who C.W. was. She didn't know why her daughter had mentioned rain. But something about the image felt wrong, not because of what it showed, but because of where it had been, hidden, sealed inside a wall in a house no one had lived in for years. That night, after Evie had gone to sleep, Ariel searched the address online. It didn't take long. A handful of old articles, missing persons forms, a digital flyer with 2 faces, Melissa Warner, 29, Caleb Warner, 3, disappeared April 16th, 2009. Last seen returning home to this exact unit. Her stomach twisted. She read everything she could, every theory. Every comment. A green van, a locked door, a reclusive neighbor, a missing boy. And now, a drawing in her wall. Signed C.W. It didn't feel like coincidence anymore. She took the drawing to the local police department the next morning. Explained how she'd found it. Explained what her daughter had said. The officer on duty listened, nodded, scanned the flyer she'd printed, and said he'd pass it along to Cold Case. "It might be nothing," he said, "just an old tenant's leftover." But by then, Ariel already knew. Some houses hold on to things, some stories refuse to stay buried, and children, more than anyone, seem to hear the echoes that adults have learned to ignore. Evie hadn't made it up. She'd heard something. And now, so had Ariel. 7. The drawing behind the wall. Word count, 850, 900. Behind the panel is a water-damaged page torn from a child's sketch pad, a crude drawing of a woman and boy standing beside a man in a green van. The drawing is signed C.W. Ariel takes it to the police. Cold Case detectives reopen the Warner file and examine the panel more closely. A crawlspace is discovered behind the wall. It connects both units, behind a sealed hatch into Gregory Neal's old side. A child's drawing becomes a crack in the case, and the walls themselves begin to whisper what was once sealed away. The drawing was more damaged than it first appeared, faded by time, the edges curled, the colors smudged and water-stained, but even so, the image was unmistakable. A woman and a small child stood to the left of the page, stick figures with wide, round eyes. The boy's arms reached upward, as if clinging to the woman's hand. Beside them, larger, darker, was a green rectangle on 4 crooked wheels. Above it, scribbled in shaky letters, was one word, van. and in the bottom right corner, written faintly in red crayon, 2 letters, C.W., Caleb Warner. The drawing sat inside a sealed evidence bag on the desk of Detective Andrea Phelps, recently assigned to cold cases after a decade in missing persons. She'd read the Warner file twice, once during training, and again when Ariel Graham walked into the station and placed the bag on the counter with shaking hands. Ariel had already told the front desk officer everything she knew, about the vent, about her daughter, about the panel in the wall, but it wasn't until Phelps saw the drawing for herself that she felt the undercurrent of something old, long buried, beginning to stir. She called in a warrant that afternoon. With Ariel's cooperation and a signed affidavit from the property management company, detectives returned to the duplex. The wall panel in the hallway was removed completely. Behind it, they found more than just insulation. There was space. At first glance, it looked like a standard wall cavity, until one of the detectives noticed light leaking through a gap between the studs. They widened the opening carefully. Dust spilled out. Behind the drywall, a narrow passage extended deeper than expected, just wide enough for a child to crawl through. At the far end was something unexpected. A sealed wooden hatch, old, weathered, padlocked from the other side. The position didn't line up with Ariel's unit. When they measured, it became clear. The passage extended directly into what used to be Gregory Neal's side of the duplex. The air inside the crawl space was stagnant, cold, the kind of air that doesn't move unless it's forced. They documented everything, measurements, angles, photographs from every direction. Phelps stood at the edge of the opening for a long time, just staring at that hatch, her flashlight beam hovering over the padlock that hadn't seen light in decades. By morning, the warrant to enter Neal's long-abandoned unit was signed. The locksmith arrived just before noon. The rear door opened with some resistance, hinges groaning like they hadn't moved in years. Inside, the air was musty, thick with the scent of aged wood and long-forgotten furniture. Dust coated everything. A recliner, a coffee table with an untouched layer of newspapers, a rotary phone with the cord half-coiled. The kitchen clock still read 3:59. The team moved room to room with care. Nothing seemed disturbed, no signs of recent entry. But in the hallway closet, behind a row of coats stiff with time, they found the other side of the hatch, padlocked and weather-stained, identical to the one found in the crawl space. They opened it. The air that escaped was different, older, sour, metallic. The crawl space stretched between both units, narrow and low-ceilinged, dust layering every surface like ash. They found candy wrappers, crumpled tissues, a plastic hair clip, and, tucked into the farthest corner, a small toy car. Yellow with chipped paint, the kind Melissa had described Caleb playing with. For the first time in 16 years, the Warner case had physical evidence. Crime scene investigators sealed both units. Forensics swept the crawl space for biological material, trace evidence, hair, skin cells. Samples were bagged and tagged. Cadaver dogs were brought in. The dogs didn't alert inside the crawl space, but something about the space felt wrong. Not just its size, but its silence, a place where someone could hide or be hidden. Phelps began rebuilding the case from scratch. She pulled the old interviews, noted what was said, and more importantly, what wasn't. Gregory Neal had never allowed investigators into his basement. They hadn't asked. He'd volunteered an alibi, said he was visiting family in Kentucky. Police called the number he gave. Someone answered. A woman claimed to be his sister, said she remembered the visit, but she was never interviewed in person. No ticket stubs, no bank transactions to prove travel. Just a phone call, taken at face value. The more Phelps looked, the less solid that alibi became. She tracked down the sister, Mary Neal, now living in assisted care. When asked about April of 2009, her memory was foggy. She recalled speaking to Gregory on the phone, but a visit. "No," she said, "not that week. He said he was busy." That single discrepancy reframed the entire case. Suddenly, the idea of Gregory Neal being gone that week didn't hold. The man who lived behind a sealed crawl space, the man whose wall now held a child's drawing of a van, a drawing no one could explain, found 16 years after the boy who signed it vanished without a trace. Phelps requested permission to excavate beneath the duplex foundation, starting with the shared basement. The team returned with ground-penetrating radar. And beneath the floor, in a corner of the slab nearest the crawlspace wall, they found something unusual. A density anomaly. Roughly rectangular, shallow, about 5 feet long. It didn't match any known piping or ductwork. The old basement everyone had forgotten was about to speak for the first time, and this time, someone was listening. He warrant was signed without hesitation. Detectives returned to the right side of the duplex the next morning. The property, still owned by the estate of Gregory Neal, hadn't been entered since the previous forensic sweep. Boards covered the windows now. A rusted mailbox hung crooked near the door. The key still worked. No one had changed the locks. Inside, it was as if time had paused mid-breath. A faint layer of dust blanketed every surface. The air was sour and stale. A recliner sagged under its own weight. Yellowed newspapers sat in stacks by the couch, dates ranging from 2008 to early 2011. Dishes were still in the drying rack. An old coat hung by the back door. Everything smelled of mildew, long-closed windows, and a kind of quiet that had settled too deeply. It took nearly an hour for the team to work through the main rooms again, taking new photographs, collecting updated samples. But it was the laundry room that stopped them cold. At first glance, the room seemed unremarkable. Washer, dryer, mop bucket in the corner. But along the far side, beneath the window that overlooked the overgrown backyard, one floorboard had curved upward in a gentle arc. A slight bulge, easy to miss. Someone had noticed it during the last visit but marked it as warping from age. This time, they took a closer look. The wood was softer than the rest, damp around the edges, and discolored slightly, grayish-white with a faint crack along the seam. They pried it up carefully. Beneath it was concrete, not the original slab. This was poured unevenly, patchy, with trowel marks still visible along the edges. Rough work, hasty. There were no records of any repairs done to this part of the home, no permit, no work order, just a thin sheet of improvised flooring, sealed over with cheap wood and forgotten. They called in forensics. The ground-penetrating radar had already hinted at something beneath the basement, but this was the first time they'd found direct access. Over the next several hours, the team cleared the laundry room completely. They lifted surrounding boards, exposed the full scope of the poured concrete. It covered a 5 by 7 foot area, rectangular, too smooth, too intentional. They began drilling by nightfall. The first layer cracked with a dull, hollow thud, revealing that it wasn't laid on solid ground. There was space beneath, a subfloor cavity, just deep enough to hold something, or someone. Word spread quickly. The next morning, the driveway was blocked off with crime scene tape. A mobile forensics unit arrived. News vans hovered at a distance, unsure what they were waiting for, but sensing the weight in the air. It had been 16 years since Melissa Warner and her 3-year-old son, Caleb, walked into this duplex and never came out. And now, finally, there was something solid beneath their feet. It took 3 days to finish the excavation. The team worked slowly, scraping layer by layer, documenting every inch. The concrete gave way unevenly. Chunks were removed by hand to preserve whatever might lie beneath. The smell came first, faint but distinct, a mustiness that didn't belong to concrete or mildew. Then, fabric, matted, discolored, clinging to something beneath. When they cleared the last of the debris, they found what no one had dared to hope or fear would still be there. 2 bodies, one adult female, one child, tucked side by side in the shallow cavity. Preserved by time, by concrete, by isolation. The mother's arms were bent, palms up, as if still reaching toward her child. The child lay on his side, facing her, bones curled as if asleep. There were no caskets, no bags, just silence and space and a crude burial done in a hurry. Dental records confirmed it within 48 hours. Melissa Warner, Caleb Warner, declared deceased, April 16, 2009. The town held its breath. No one knew what to say. For years, people had speculated. Abduction, escape, voluntary disappearance, the green van, the locked door. But the answer had been just inches beneath the floor the whole time, hidden by a man who had lived the rest of his life on the other side of the same wall. Forensics worked quickly. The bones were transported. A forensic anthropologist began the examination. No major trauma was found on Melissa, no bullet wounds, no fractures, just positional compression, shallow soil residue, and long-term decay. Caleb's remains were harder to assess. A child's bones are more fragile, but no sign of violent trauma was immediately visible. Toxicology would take longer. Detectives combed through Neil's history again. They found no diary, no confession, no suicide note, just silence. But his movements, his access, his false alibi, combined with the location of the remains, painted a picture that was hard to ignore. He hadn't needed a van. He hadn't needed to break in. He'd been the neighbor. He'd watched. He'd waited. And when the moment came, he acted. No one had thought to look in his home. Not then. Not when he smiled politely and said he'd been out of town. Not when the smell lingered for weeks. Not when Melissa's family stood just feet away from the one place she'd been buried. The town mourned again. Vigils were held, candles lit. Melissa and Caleb's names were spoken softly on the news, as if not to disturb the ground. They had never left. They had never run. They had simply been hidden where no one wanted to believe evil could live, in the house next door. And finally, the floor that had hidden them for 16 years stood open, unable to lie anymore. The notebook page was buried near the child's ribs, folded once and tucked into what remained of a small jacket pocket. It had survived somehow, protected from moisture, time, and decay by a thin plastic sleeve. The ink had bled in places and the paper had softened into something like fabric, but the words were still legible. A single page, torn from a lined spiral pad with one name written over and over, Caleb. Sometimes in block letters, sometimes in careful, jagged lowercase. In the corner, a sentence, smaller, tighter, as if written with what little space or strength remained. He said we couldn't go back. The evidence team moved slowly, documenting everything around it, the way the note had been folded, its position in the pocket, the fingerprints too smudged to lift cleanly. But no one needed a print to know who had written it. It was his name, his message, the last thing he'd been able to leave behind before the light or the air ran out. The remains of Caleb Warner showed no clear signs of trauma, no broken bones, no blunt force injuries. The forensic anthropologist noted slight bruising patterns in the cartilage, possible signs of restraint, but nothing definitive. Melissa's remains were more conclusive. Microfractures in the wrist bones, a possible injury to the jaw, defensive wounds, but nothing instantly fatal. Together, the findings told a story that wasn't violent in the traditional sense, more methodical, psychological, controlled. By the end of the week, cold case investigators had a clearer picture of how long Gregory Neal's lies had gone unchallenged. His alibi, visiting his sister in Kentucky, was finally dismantled. New interviews with her former caregivers revealed inconsistencies in dates. Records confirmed no credit card activity, no travel history, no vehicle rentals that matched the timeline. And then came the vehicle records. The green van. In 2006, Gregory Neal had owned a dark green 2001 Dodge Ram van, registered to the same Tanglewood address. In 2008, he reported it as junked due to transmission failure. No bill of sale, no documented tow, just a handwritten note in DMV records indicating it had been hauled off by a local salvage service. The company had since gone out of business. No trace of the van remained. But now that van had a witness, a crayon drawing recovered from a wall cavity signed by a boy who hadn't lived long enough to say the words aloud. It showed what he'd seen, what he'd known, and maybe what he'd feared. The drawing, the note, the sealed crawl space, the false alibi. Each piece pointed back to Neal, and as detectives combed through what was left of his life, they began to uncover something deeper, something that explained how a man could live so quietly beside a crime so loud. He'd never married, no children, no criminal record. But his employment history was curious. After retiring from the post office, he'd volunteered briefly at a local after-school reading program, only for a few months. The director remembered him as quiet, helpful, but eventually said he left without notice. There had been no complaints, officially. But one staff member recalled a troubling conversation with a child who said the man with glasses had tried to follow her into the restroom. The program tightened their supervision policies afterward, but nothing was reported, nothing documented. In the basement of his unit, Detectives found boxes of old magazines, newspaper clippings, and notebooks filled with incoherent lists, grocery items, names, repeated phrases. Some pages contained drawings, crude, childlike, similar to the one found behind Ariel's wall. Investigators believed they may have been copied, traced, or forged. One sheet showed a stick figure standing beside what looked like a van. Another showed a figure in a box with lines like bars drawn across the top. The crawl space, the sealed panel, the subfloor cavity. The progression felt deliberate, built over time, used more than once. They couldn't prove that. But it was clear now that Melissa hadn't left her house that day. She'd locked her front door, dropped her keys in the bowl, maybe started laundry. Caleb likely played in the living room. Then a knock, or maybe not even that, just a familiar voice next door, an offer of help. An excuse, something small, enough to draw her to the shared basement or the rear walkway between units. Investigators believed Melissa had been lured, that whatever happened, it escalated fast, a confrontation, an injury, a decision made in panic or cold calculation. Caleb may have seen, may have cried, may have been led into the crawl space, and then sealed in, with nothing but dust, darkness, and a piece of paper to tell the world who he was. The psychological toll was harder to measure. Why leave a note? Why write his name? Some forensic psychologists believe children repeat their names in moments of fear to remember who they are. Others say it's a call, a hope someone will find them. Either way, Caleb had written his truth. He said we couldn't go back. It echoed like a riddle. Who was he? Neil? Someone else? Did it mean they'd tried to leave and were stopped? Or was it something more final? Detective Andrea Phelps stared at that sentence for a long time. It didn't sound like panic. It sounded like resignation. A quiet boy in a narrow space, writing with whatever time he had left. And for 16 years, no one knew it was there, until the walls themselves began to give him back. The press conference drew a modest crowd, local outlets, a few stringers from regional papers. The Warner case had long been a quiet tragedy, too old for national attention, too unresolved to keep headlines. But now, after 16 years, it had a resolution. Detectives stood in front of the podium with carefully prepared statements. The words were clinical, measured. Remains positively identified. Cause of death undetermined. Investigation concluded. They said the name Gregory Neal publicly for the first time. They called it an intentional concealment of death, a closed case. The town absorbed the news slowly, like a bruise finally surfacing. Tanglewood Drive became the center of quiet pilgrimage. Neighbors drove by with headlights off. Strangers walked the sidewalk with printed flyers, reading each line as if decoding a riddle already solved. Some brought flowers, others brought questions. But the duplex stayed cordoned off, its windows covered, its walls stripped of silence. 3 days after the press conference, a woman named Lorraine Whitman knocked on the door of the police station, 86 years old, widowed, had lived next to the duplex since 1982. She used a cane. Her hands trembled when she spoke. She wasn't there to demand anything. She just wanted to tell someone what she'd heard. She hadn't spoken up in 2009. Not out of malice, she said, but because what she heard hadn't felt like anything, not at the time. She lived in the unit just behind the duplex, across the narrow strip of lawn. The windows of her kitchen looked directly at the rear wall of 419 and 421 Tanglewood. The night Melissa vanished, Lorraine had been washing dishes around 10 p.m. Her window was cracked open. The night was still. She remembered the smell of lilacs from the fence, and she remembered hearing something faint through the air, muffled sobbing. She didn't look out. She didn't investigate. She assumed it was a child throwing a tantrum, that someone had left a window open and put their kid in time out. It wasn't constant, just soft start and stop crying. At one point, she thought she heard tapping or scratching. But again, she assumed it was nothing. The next morning, around dawn, she heard it again, softer, shorter, and then never again. It wasn't until she saw the excavation on the news, the floor pulled open, the remains of a boy pulled from the ground, that the sound came back to her, perfectly clear. She wept when she told Detective Phelps. "I didn't know what it was. I didn't understand what I was hearing." I thought. She didn't finish the sentence. Her statement was documented. It didn't change the outcome. It didn't change the timeline, but it added something final to the story. Caleb Warner hadn't died immediately. He had lived, if only for a night. Long enough to cry, long enough to call out in the only way a child knows how. Authorities revised their timeline. They believed Melissa had been lured, perhaps through the shared basement or rear walkway. Gregory Neal may have offered to help with groceries or claimed he'd seen something suspicious. Once inside, something happened. A struggle. An injury. Melissa was killed. Whether planned or not, they would never know. Caleb was likely kept in the crawl space, not restrained, not hurt, just hidden, until Neal decided what to do next. And by then, it was too late. There was no evidence of anyone else's involvement. The drawings, the note, the false alibi. It all traced back to one person. Neal had built a trap no one suspected, a plan concealed by familiarity. He hadn't needed to break in. He hadn't needed to abduct anyone. He lived on the other side of the wall. In July, Melissa and Caleb were laid to rest in a joint ceremony. Their caskets were small, simple, a white one for Caleb, a pale wooden one for Melissa. The service was quiet. Denise Warner spoke. Amanda read a poem written by Melissa in high school. There was no mention of how they died, only that they were loved, that they were together, that they were home. In early August, the town installed a small plaque in the shared front yard of the duplex, brass set into a square of concrete near the sidewalk where Melissa and Caleb once walked home from daycare. It read, "They were never far, only unheard." People stopped to read it. Kids riding bikes slowed down. Some left flowers. Others left drawings, crayon stick figures with green vans, smiling suns, names written in shaky lines. Ariel Graham moved out quietly. She never spoke to the media, never gave interviews. But neighbors saw her standing once at the edge of the plaque, Evie beside her, holding a red flower in one hand and her mother's fingers in the other. Neither of them spoke. Then they turned and walked away. Detective Phelps boxed up the final file in September. A name label, a closing note, and a photo, Caleb's drawing, now sealed in archival plastic, stored with evidence tags. A case no longer open, but never forgotten. Because sometimes the most terrifying answers aren't buried deep. They're next door, across the hall, behind a wall. They live in routines, in kindness, in familiarity. The truth wasn't in the woods, or the van, or the river. It had been one wall away, all along.